I think it's taught me self-confidence, the ability to be self-motivated and self-directed, which is certainly something I look for in the workplace as I'm hiring and that sort of thing. Uh, it's taught me how to learn on my own by myself. I'm continuing to take college classes, graduate classes. I'm continuing my studies in that way, but I still find myself going off with the textbook and learning best that way. It's not that lectures aren't important, but I find myself curling up with the book and working through it myself instead of uh, calling the professor necessarily, which I suppose that could be taken both ways, but I'd consider it something of a strength. Um,
Um, I never wanted to go to school. My mom would ask every year, do you want to go to school this year or do you want to keep being homeschooled? And I always chose being homeschooled. I thought about trying school sometimes, but I always felt like there were too many other things I wanted to do and school would take up too much time. And so that's why I chose to be homeschooled.
It wasn't as formal. It wasn't as if my parents came to me every year and said, Ben, do you want to be homeschooled this year? But there were certainly other opportunities. My dad taught in the Christian school system, or in various Christian schools as I was growing up, and I would have certainly had the opportunity to attend those. And of course, the public schools were always an option as well. It was never something I was very interested in. I was academically farther ahead than most people my age. And so to go back to school, I would have been forced to choose between maintaining my subject area interests and being with people my age. And frankly, I was and still am a bit of an introvert. And so the ability to work by myself at my own pace was a pretty big deal to me, and I didn't really want to get back into a more traditional school system.
I think for me, I very much enjoyed being homeschooled the way we were and growing up, but I think it was important to have the choices that my mom did ask whether I would want to go to school. And my sister chose to go to school for part of 8th grade, since she had the choice too. So I think that was important, having that choice. And sometimes I wish there were more homeschoolers in our area, that I could be with my friends more. But other than that, I really enjoyed the way I grew up and my experience being homeschooled.
I was going to jump back to the earlier question for just a second. I remembered that during during the 3rd grade, I actually went to school for about half the year. I decided to try it. It was one of those cases where my father was teaching in a Christian day school, and so I had the opportunity to go. I don't know if it was cheaper or my parents just made the money work somehow. And I went back to the classroom, and I hated it. It was just a miserable experience for me. Probably because, as I say, I was an introvert and was sort of a geeky, nerdy kid anyway at the best of times. The other children weren't always as kind as they could have been. But I'm sure some of it was my fault too. I wasn't particularly suave or anything. Anyway, jumping ahead then to your question about what would we change, what would we do differently, what advice would we give? It feels like so much has changed that it's hard to know where to begin on that. I'm 30. I started being homeschooled at 6, so it's been almost 25 years. When we started, homeschooling was virtually unknown. Okay, some people were doing it, but it was a very, very small number across the country. Everywhere you'd go, if you'd say you were homeschooled, you had to explain what that meant and how that worked. And I got sick and tired as a kid. Why are you asking me again what this is? I've explained to 50 people already. So it was, and there weren't, you talked about being involved in support groups and co-ops and those sorts of things. There weren't. When we started, there were probably other homeschoolers in the area, but I don't remember any of them, at least for the first couple of years. It was us, and that was it. And as far as curriculum went, we talked about how we determined and chose our own. There really weren't homeschool specific curriculums. Nobody had written those things yet. The best we could do would be to pick up a school curriculum meant for a small private school and try to adapt that. And in the elementary grades, that worked pretty well. But then as you get older, it's one thing to teach multiplication, it's another thing to teach calculus. It's tough for me to know what advice I'd give, just again because things have changed. I suppose I could go for the sort of common platitudes, stick with it, be confident, it'll work out okay. Yeah, and I'd echo Sarah's comments about choice and freedom of choice, freedom of control. I think that's a real benefit that homeschooling offers. You can customize this stuff. You can come up with an educational program that is specifically tailored to your child, your children, and what their needs and what their interests are. And from my experience coming through college and from my experience in the business world, that's incredibly valuable. And the skills that kids learn through that process are incredibly valuable.
Well, when I went to college and entered the teacher education program, I started going into public schools and doing practica there and seeing what they were like. And it was so different from the philosophy I grew up with and the way I learned. The sort of traditional school ideas that you learn certain things at certain times, that you have to be taught to learn. And when I was growing up, it was very different. I was learning on my own, learning from my interests, and so I started looking for other people who had learned that way and found out that there were schools all over the US and all over the world where people had the same ideas and philosophy that I had grown up with. That people can be self-directed, that learning comes from your intrinsic motivation. And I took a year off from college and visited some of the schools and just saw how the kids were coming there. There weren't adults telling them what to do. They were deciding on their own what they wanted to learn and how they wanted to learn.